Wilbur wound up as a recluse in a house in Pennsylvania. And from his description, the whole house is moldy and falling apart. So he lives with all this mold. He inherited the house from his mother and father that had this house in Pennsylvania, and that's where he lives. And basically, he bought, when he got money from these paintings, and he would get $5,000 to $10,000 for a painting. He worked for the Franklin Mint, and they would have limited editions of steam engines or a baseball player. You could buy this china with hand-painted pictures on it. And I think they were screened and repeated, but they were limited number of plates that he would do. And he got terrific money for that, and he worked as an illustrator. He had an agent, and that's how I found him. I found him through his agent. This many years later, I hadn't seen him for over 40 years, and I found his agent, and I called her and talked to her, and she said, "I'm sorry, Richard will not talk to anybody. He doesn't have a computer, he doesn't accept email, he's not interested in computers at all." And I asked, "Does he have any way I can contact him?" She said, "Well, he has a telephone, but it's answered by a machine, an answering machine, and he won't answer." So I called his number one evening. I was so thinking about him, and I said, "Richard, answer the phone, you son of a bitch." I said, "This is your old friend from high school. Do you remember Jerry Hochberg?" And he picked up the phone. He says, "Hochberg, you son of a bitch, how the hell are you?" And we started talking. We talked about an hour. And I asked him what the hell he's doing, and he had bought he says he's got like 5 recumbent bicycles, and he rides up in the mountains in Pennsylvania. And he lives in a house by himself. And he told me he doesn't answer the phone, but if he hears me, he told me he'll answer it. And we talked, and I was just thrilled. I told him I was in Bangkok, Thailand, and I had been here for 28 years. It was a wonderful reunion and talking to him again. We had so many memories, and I remember he used to love these spaghetti westerns. He was a great fan of film, and especially the old westerns, you know. He would love the characters because he could paint the characters and draw them, you know. And these were guys that were going to have a gunfight, and he could pick up all the drama, and he'd do it all out of his head, you know, anytime he was interested. I remember there was a little time in his life, it wasn't little, it was like 2-3 years, when he was living in the same city that I was, and we were both born there. He actually bought a view camera, an 8x10, big bellows view camera with a Schneider lens, because he was making money all the time. And he went to Ireland, to the cliffs of Ireland, and he got interested in a photographer named George Tice, and who developed this platinum process, which had incredible detail. If you want to look it up, his name is George Tice. Well, Richard studied. He always studied on his own, and he perfected himself. And he was a portrait photographer, or a landscape photographer. And I saw his prints. One day I was down the cellar, and there were some of his prints. He processed things himself. He did everything himself. He mixed pigment himself when he painted. This guy was such an amazing savant type person. And again, he'll always stand out in my life because, first of all, we were not in the in crowd in high school. You know, there were the football players who had the girls, and it was just so different for us, anyhow. I started teaching when I was 20 years old, and really that's how I started in this profession. I just fell in love with it. First of all, I was in a school system I was really comfortable with. I knew all the teachers in the school. I knew a lot of the teachers in the whole school system. And it was wonderful. This is a very urban school system which had changed even when I went to college and came out. The dynamics and the makeup of the whole city changed a lot. And many more Spanish people from a lot of influx from Cuba, so we had a lot of Cubans in the town. City Hall was mainly Spanish, and all the signs in the town were Spanish. It was a fantastic system, and I started at a high school as a substitute teacher, and I did that every day of the week. I subbed for some other teacher. Many of those teachers were my teacher. I remember I got a poor grade in biology, and I had this Irish lady that I loved. Her name was Mrs. Riley. She was a real scientist, just as a person. She loved biology. Of course, my father was a doctor, so that gave me a lot to live up to, you know. But I really hated the labs in those classes. The specimens that we worked on, that we had to dissect, were all coming out of Carolina Biological in these big bottles. You'd have frogs and everything else. And of course, we had to pin these specimens out and find their liver and find their heart. And the smell of formaldehyde was just incredible. I just hated that smell. Later on, they discovered that formaldehyde causes cancer. So it's amazing. So in those days, all the specimens were preserved in that. I refused to do quite a few labs, and as a result, I got some really poor grades. And to bring those kind of grades home to my father, you got to be brave. My father has a hair-trigger temper, and I would show him the report card, and he'd ask me a few questions, and then he'd give me a good belt, either in the head or my old man. There wasn't much between getting beat up and there wasn't any talking in my family. You know, he did ask me to explain why I refused to do the labs, and then he said, "You'll do those dissections or I'll dissect you." That was my old man's answer to it. Anyhow, I came to that school after I graduated college. I was an art teacher, and I got a job as art teacher in Jefferson High School, which was my dream. The same high school that I loved these two art teachers I had. We had two wonderful art teachers named Paul Nye, and he's gone now, and Julie Provine, and I think Julie died too. These guys were so clever, and they were both really pretty good draftsmen, pretty good artists in their own right. And it was an interesting time because we had Polish people, and we had a lot of blacks and a lot of Spanish kids, and there weren't many Jews in the school. And Julie Provine was an Italian, and he had a great sense of humor, and he looked a lot like James Cagney. Yeah, that was amazing. And he was just as quick as James Cagney in the way he talked. He was a really handsome, rather short man, but funnier than hell, and all the kids in our classes loved him, you know. And in those days, you just had some crayons and charcoal, and you drew a lot, and there was a lot of classical painting. But I was interested in engineering a lot, in mechanics, so somehow I had to work that into art. And I had this guy in my classroom who, to this day, he's my age now. I think he's 76 years old, and his name is Richard Bober. And he was very antisocial, didn't like girls. He was into drawing and painting, and his work was anatomical. It was amazing. And he is one of two savants that I've met in my lifetime. Do you all know what a savant is? A savant is a person where there's no explanation for their skill or talent. Richard Bober could draw anatomically correct figures and tell a story with a visual as an illustrator in seconds. And you watch him draw, and there was just no explanation. He never had any training. He just liked to draw. And in my classroom, Well, I never forgot him. Actually, I called him up not too long ago, and that's a story for another video, which I will tell. But Richard Bober was an amazing, amazing talent. And I think he studied a lot about anatomy, because many times he called me up on the phone. I had a car, and he was born to a General Motors assembly line worker who didn't make a lot of money. His father and mother, they lived in sort of on the edge of the Italian district and way out on the edge of Elizabeth. And I came from relatively, I could say, money, because my father was a doctor and he was a very popular dentist in the city. He was really a craftsman, my father. So Bober used to call me up and used to say, "Hochberg, what are you doing now?" No matter what I was doing, it was never important to him. He never even gave me a second for an explanation. He would just say, "Get over here and bring your car and take me to the library." And I used to chauffeur this kid around because I respected him as an incredible artist. He was just the most amazing guy you ever met. So I would go with Richard and take him to the library, and I'd wait for him. And he'd look at a lot of anatomical books. He would check out a load of books, and I'd drive him back to his house. And he would not let me see his work. He had paintings all down the cellar. He painted under a broken arm light, like an arm with the tube, fluorescent tube hanging out of it. And I could see his palettes and his few brushes that he had. But his paintings were amazing. And occasionally, he would have to go to the bathroom when we're down the cellar, and he would say to me, "Don't you look at any of my work when I'm going to the bathroom." And of course, that's exactly what I would do. I would sneak up. His paintings were all turned towards the brick wall in the basement. The basement was flooded several times. There was actually a water line around the basement and over several of his paintings. He used to paint on masonite, and I would turn them around. And they were Dutch master paintings with amazing light coming through the windows. And he always drew these incredible characters, sort of ghoulish looking people, dogs. Animals were in his pictures, and they were represented like people. And I mean, his work was amazing. The anatomical underlying gesture in some of these figures that he did, well, it just looked like you were looking at the Dutch masters, like you were looking at a Titian or one of the older historical painters. His work was phenomenal. And I thought, when we both go to the same college, and we did, we both got into Pratt Institute. And Bober was very recluse, and he wouldn't do the work as prescribed. I remember one painting he did, which was assigned to us after we studied trompe-l'oeil painting, which in French means fool the eye. And these paintings could be, I remember his in particular, it was a piece of a crab with a postage stamp. And he got all the shadows were amazing. It actually looked like a real postage stamp that you could just lift off. He did it on a gessoed board on a piece of masonite, and it was so photorealistic. It just blew every other painting away, and he did some complicated things. He had the crab shell on a piece of wood. In the painting, it was a piece of wood, but of course, this was just painted on a board, but the wood looked like wood. It was grained. You even could tell what kind of wood it was. And the crab shell had little glints of light on the points on it, and it was a broken piece of crab shell with I think an American postage stamp on it. The stamp was painted so photorealistically. I mean, Bober was an absolute master, even in college. And I think the painting teacher, and I can say this for a fact, his name was Peter Payon. It was a nature structure class that this project was in. When these were all hung in the hallways of Pratt, there was a crowd around this one painting, and it was Bober's. It wasn't large, it was small, but it was just masterly done, you know. And he that didn't surprise me, that when I went down the hall and, you know, students would congregate, that everybody was around that Bober's painting. And I actually think Peter Payon, the teacher, was a bit jealous, because Peter Payon was a great painter. He painted, used a lot of level of glazes in his paintings. He could paint leather to look like leather and fabric, and he was a really quality painter. His paintings were a lot like Bober, and I think he was jealous of Bober, actually. I think Bober got a hard time in that college, and actually I think he failed out of Pratt. He never completed Pratt. But I'll never forget this guy. He, just before I took a job in Bangkok teaching, I had a wonderful bicycle. I had a recumbent bike. It's called an Infinity. I bought it in New York. It was about $700 US. That's not expensive for a recumbent. A recumbent could cost about $5,000 to $3,000. Anyhow, I gave him that bicycle because he had the onset of some disease. I think it was like muscular dystrophy or MS. I'm not sure what it was, but it was a pity because he was becoming sort of immobile. And just before I left, I went over his house and I told him that I had gotten this job in Bangkok, and that's what I was going to do. I was going to teach in Bangkok, Thailand. And I gave him my bike. I was going to go and sell him the bike, but I loved this guy and looked up to him so long that I just gave him my bicycle. I contacted his agent in America because I found him in a book. I found some of his illustrations in a book. He freelanced, worked for Alfred Hitchcock magazine, and he did a lot of illustration for Penthouse and Playboy magazine. He actually had, when authors did stories, he would do the cover art for that story. You know, Playboy had a lot of good writing in it, a lot of good articles and stories, and Bober often did the illustration as the lead cover for these stories in the magazine. And I know he did a lot of illustration for Alfred Hitchcock magazine, which was an amazing little magazine that you would buy with Alfred Hitchcock stories in them. And he'd do these ghoulish figures and the most amazing light, always Rembrandt lighting and fantastic structure in his paintings. And if you look him up, his name is Richard Bober, Boober. We grew up together, and I have several stories to tell about Richard Bober, but I idolized him, and he just was miles over in front of everybody in our art class. He was the draftsman, and actually the art teacher, Julie, took him under his wing and had Bober doing airbrush for him. Bober became a very expert. Julie fell in love with some girl who owned a company that makes the rings for engines, and they needed an artist for their art and their advertisements. And Richard went along with Julie on many occasions, and I even think the art teachers in high school were jealous of Richard because of his amazing talent. And he learned to use airbrush, and I think he used a Pache airbrush, and he used to do these stainless rings that they put in engine, they're compression rings, around the cylinder, or inside the cylinder. And Julie's girlfriend had this company. And then I remember Bober became enamored with her, and he actually kind of took her away from Julie in lots of ways. She liked him. She was much older than him, and I think her name was Lonnie, and that was the love of Bober's life forever. I mean, that That went on for like 30 years after. Well, I don't think Julie's around, but Bober's still enamored with this girl named Lonnie, and I always hear the story, and you can hear when he talks about her how much in love he was with her, but it never came to anything.